The National Museum of Funeral History presents The Final Curtain Never Closes. I'm your host, Genevieve Keeney Vasquez, the president and CEO of the museum. Today, we are going to be talking with Barbara Kemmis, who is the executive director of CANA. CANA is also the acronym for the Cremation Association of North America. So welcome, Barbara. I am so happy to have you with me today.
Thanks, Genevieve. It's so great to be here.
When I first met you, and even myself for coming into this profession, if you don't grow up in it and you're not consistently surrounded with it, when you begin to embark upon it, because it's your lifelong driven passion that we all possess somewhere deep inside of us, there's always learning curves involved, and there's always new things to discover. So I know how I started in the industry. What got you started, Barbara?
Sure. Well, I'm actually a librarian and an association executive, and I'm not a licensed funeral director or cemeterian or crematory operator or any of those things. So my path was I am fascinated by research and data-driven decision-making and associations. And nobody grows up knowing about associations. You kind of stumble into it, and sure enough, that's what I did. But bringing people together is the best way to both have fun and get things done. So that's what associations do, is they bring people together. In CANA's case, people with a common interest in cremation and cremation best practices. And that's what we're known for, cremation operations, as well as statistics to make, to understand what the cremation trends are and to make business decisions. So I came to it, I answered a job ad, and I wanted to be an executive director after working in a library association, and before that a library. And I fell in love. During the interview, I thought, it's really a shame that I don't know anything about cremation. They're certainly not going to hire me, because the funeral directors and cemeterians in this room interviewing me are really cool people, and I think it would be fun to work with them. And lo and behold, I got the job. So that's a long story short. And 11 years later, I'm still here, still fascinated by the work, and have learned a great deal over the decades. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that you definitely are the right person for the position, because ever since I've known you, I have learned a lot from you. And you were talking about how you try to make everything fun. I don't think I've ever been to a convention or a meeting with you, or even our board meetings. And I do also have to mention that you are a board member here for the National Museum of Funeral History, and we welcome your expertise, your connections, and everything that you contribute to our industry. And we're very, very grateful to that, and hence the reason why you're on our board. But I think that, understanding statistics and trends is quite fascinating. When I was in my own personal studies of psychology and having to do my statistics class, I have to admit that was probably my most boring one. So my hat is off to people who really find a passion, an interest, and a drive to that. So what does drive you into statistics and doing some of these number crunches, and what is your takeaway from that? What do you find still today awe-inspiring when you work with all these numbers?
What fascinates me about statistics and research and the numbers is they answer questions, or they give us insights. So many times, we ask a question and we think, oh, there's no answer, I'll go with my gut. Right? Like I know my business, I know my community, I know I'm experienced in this, I'll go with my gut. But then sometimes in the back of your mind, there's this like, well, should I have looked to see if if there's research or numbers or anything like that? And one thing I think people don't understand about funeral service is how rapidly things change. Okay. Right. I mean, the old joke is, what's for sure, death and taxes, right? You're always going to have death and taxes. But over even the last 10 years that I've been with CANA, during that time period, we've seen the general population of the United States and Canada embrace cremation, and now it's more than 50% of dispositions in the United States, grows steadily, predictably. And so we want to know why. Why are people embracing cremation? And of course, there's multiple reasons. CANA tends to look at national and state level trends, but funeral homes and cemeteries and crematories operate at the local level. So they can use our data for benchmarking, and we know our members may look at cremation rate growth and go to the bank for a loan to expand their business or build a crematory. Or they may say, this is growing fast. Maybe we want to change our marketing messaging and outreach, and so that's what interests me is when, okay, the numbers are fascinating, great, here's an image, a chart of how it's growing, but how can it be useful, right? How can we make decisions based on that data that are strong? And I'm constantly surprised because the answers do change. It used to be, oh, people are choosing cremation because of price, right? Price. Cremation's cheaper than burial. That's why people choose it. And that was the number one reason that consumers said they choose cremation, a decade ago. And now they say, well, it's because it's what we do. It's what we choose. It's our tradition, right?
Yes.
So maybe in a family tradition, they initially chose it for price or convenience. I live in this state, and my relative died 3 states over. Where would we bury them, right? So there's other reasons why people may choose cremation, of course. But after a generation or so, it's like, oh no, it's what we do. It's just cremation is what we do. We would never, we'll never go back.
Yeah.
So, these are the kinds of things we track within CANA, and also new forms of disposition that aren't cremation, but that are coming up and of interest to consumers. So,
Can you elaborate on any of those new things?
oh, sure. I mean, there's something that's generally referred to as water cremation, the technical term being alkaline hydrolysis. It's now legal in 26 states and
Wow.
practiced in 15 states. And it's the reason it's called a form of cremation is because from the end user's perspective, okay, my loved one died. The funeral home took my loved one into their care, and I signed paperwork and everything. And then on the other end, I get what look like cremated remains, right? Which are bone fragments. But what happens in between there is different. In flame cremation, of course, there's a crematory, there's heat, there's, all the things you can imagine. With water cremation, there's water and alkali chemicals, and it takes a little bit longer than flame cremation. And there's a few other, I mean, obviously you're using sometimes warmer water, not boiling or anything, but you're not using flame, you're using water. It's actually polar opposite from a process perspective, but the end result is reducing human remains to the skeleton, the bone fragments.
Right.
So in that sense, it's similar, and legally that's been the fastest way to get it. Alkaline hydrolysis permitted is making it a form of cremation. So, okay, welcome alkaline hydrolysis practitioners. We now have members who do that. And again, from the consumer perspective, if they're interested in cremation, don't be surprised if you go to a funeral home and they say, okay, would you like water or fire? And your
Wow.
response might be, what? I didn't even know there were choices. So,
You're already distracted by grief, right? You're there
yes,
because you've lost a loved one, and now you're being faced with this new fact of a disposition that you never knew of. So, I
yeah,
mean, definitely that is something you and I will need to work on to get into the history of cremation exhibit. So that can be known and talked about and further educated on, so that when our families are faced with that decision or introduced to that concept, they won't be so shell shocked by the thought that there's another option. And then, oh my gosh, what do we do? I mean, there, unfortunately, the time of death, our love, those that we leave behind are faced with so many decisions that have to
so
be
many.
made.
Yeah,
And unless it's talked about beforehand, it really can be a daunting task. And so it's, again, one of our missions here at the museum, and and I'm sure there with CANA, is to get people to have that hard conversation, to ask those questions of what do you want done with your body when you pass away? Because like you said early on, the two most guaranteed things in life are death and taxes. But of course we can cheat on our taxes. We just can't cheat death.
True. Good joke.
So, with that being said, I think it's important for people to have that fluid thought process, and decide what is best for them: cremation or burial, and now the new one, cremation by fire or cremation by water, right?
Right.
So are there any other new things coming on the horizon within the cremation industry? I did have another question. If I can ask this question and then go back to the new trends to see if my first question leads to these new trends, and that was, what was the effect that you guys saw at CANA? And I'm sure you guys went into a full throttle mode with COVID and the major increase of required cremations due to the pandemic. What kind of effect did that have on CANA? And did some of these new trends that we're going to talk about after that are they an outcome of that, or were they something already on the horizon prior to COVID?
That's a great question. Well, they definitely were on the horizon prior to COVID and the pandemic years. But I'll finish by stating the relationship I think there exists between them. It was interesting. Numbers always tell a story, and then there's the lived experience. And the pandemic was incredible. We had a CANA meeting in Las Vegas the last week of February 2020. We were hearing something going on in China, something going, why a lot of the hotel was concerned because a lot of Chinese travelers were canceling coming to Las Vegas, which is a popular place for all tourists, including from China, and what's going on with this. And we should wash our hands more, and it was disturbing to learn how few people do wash their hands frequently throughout the day. And that's what we were joking about last week of February 2020. And then 2 weeks later, the whole world shut down, except not for funeral directors, of course,
Yeah.
not for death care professionals. They are the forgotten essential worker. Healthcare workers were thanked left, right, and center, and they deserved every moment of it. So much other awareness was raised for all of us about just who is essential to make our lives happen, right? But funeral directors were largely overlooked. And so, we went into full throttle work representing and raising awareness about what death care professionals could do. Some of that involved kind of facilitating conversations between funeral directors and cemeteries, because in some state, funeral directors and cemeterians don't always get along or regularly communicate. And that became important when all of a sudden you have, it started out regionally and then became nationally, just a mass fatality event, right? Let's call it what it was.
Yes.
Yeah. And then it was talking to government entities from the state level to the federal level to ensure that funeral directors could get PPE. There was mask shortages at the beginning, which is hard to imagine. Cleaning fluid shortage, et cetera. So there was a lot of that kind of work. And meanwhile, what were our members doing? Caring for the dead and trying to care for grieving families, except there were gathering restrictions, which was hugely problematic. So all of that was the lived experience, and that was real. Some of the businesses would say, I'm doing 3 times more cremations than I've ever done. And that turned out to be true in numbers. But when we looked at the national numbers, the cremation rate grew predictably. There was not a bump. 1.5% growth between 2019 and 2020. 1.5% growth between 2020 and 2021. People didn't seem to be choosing cremation, a greater proportion, right, of cremation over burial. But obviously there were 1 million deaths, 1 million excess deaths over those years. And so more families were faced with planning an unexpected, unanticipated death than, in five prior years, basically, when you look at the total number. And
I
so,
find that really interesting because
yeah.
I am a funeral director myself.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, the way you receive information, obviously nowadays, is through the media, through the news. And the way that it was coming across to me is I truly expected you to tell me that there was this huge bump in cremation. And here, you are you are right there on the ground level of it, and you're telling me that that wasn't so. So that just leads to believe that people were still able to make the choices for their loved one according to either
Mm-hmm.
their loved one who passed away's wishes of being buried versus cremated, or the family's wishes, or their religious expectations of disposition. So, I
Definitely.
really am actually happy that I asked this question, because it actually was a little disturbing to me to think that people were being forced to go against what it is that they truly wanted for their final disposition.
No, no, they weren't. And in the United States, anyway, the CDC very early made a statement that cremation was not required for the coronavirus. In this case, COVID. Whereas a number of years ago, when the first Ebola cases occurred in the United States, actually in Texas, right? Dallas was the first
Yes.
death. The CDC came out and said, "Oh, cremation is required for people who die of Ebola because of the uh, way the Ebola virus is transmitted up to weeks after death, right? So the notion of burial was, well, anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But the CDC, based on the experience with Ebola, said, "Oh no, coronavirus is not as transmissible after death. There's no reason not to." Because we didn't even know in those early days that was primarily airborne, right? We were cleaning surfaces and avoiding what we touched, and keeping distance from each other, because we just didn't know how critical that would be. But early on, the CDC determined that nope, cremation or burial is fine. And actually, anecdotally, what we heard from members in primarily in the Northeast, which, as we know, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, that area was like really hard hit early on in the
Hmm.
pandemic, as well as Washington State. And it wasn't really until, the summer that the virus started moving across the country. But we had cemetery members in the Northeast saying, families would come and say, well, what can you do faster, burial or cremation? And depending on their, workload, which is a horrible euphemism to use, but accurate, sometimes burial was faster than cremation. So the family chose burial over cremation. All things being equal, they wanted
Hmm.
their loved one to rest in peace after this horrible disease. And so anecdotally, we heard more of that. But I think you're right. I think people were able to choose cremation if that's what they wanted, or burial, or according to their religious or cultural preferences or directions. That was honored. But time frame, right? Like time frame
Yes.
extended. We're used to having, right, a funeral, I don't know, as quick as 5 days, everything taken care of within 5 days, maybe longer if out of town guests are coming. And in some cases, in some of those times, it was weeks, weeks, three,
Yeah.
6 weeks even. And that was unprecedented and had to contribute to the grief of the families who, didn't know. In some cases, knew where their loved one was, but didn't like thinking of them in a cooler that whole time period, right? Until the
Correct. Yeah.
crematory could catch up. So, yeah, we learned.
I can speak to that. I actually had a personal experience. My
Oh
son,
no.
I lost my grandchild of 21 weeks gestation during that time period.
Mm.
And so, yes, um, it was uncomfortable. You're right, to know that your loved one was in a cooler, waiting in, and this sounds harsh, but almost like waiting in line for their turn, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what it was. And myself being, like I said, a funeral director, I know the other side. I know what it looks like. I know the operational, but it didn't make it any easier knowing that information, and knowing what we were up against, knowing that we were in COVID times. But the grief was still there. The grief was still real. The grief maintained raw all the way through. And then we kind of went through a period of of healing, if you will. And then it was, oh, okay, now we're able to have the cremation, and it was kind of like, it was hard. The healing started, but then we kind of had to open that wound back up to finish the process. So
Yeah.
there's something to be said in that prolonged grief period. During that time, it was very difficult for people, and we highly um, commend everybody who had to go through it, both the professionals and the family members.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Genevieve. That is so hard. And you're not alone. I mean, a million families,
Yes, yes.
plus all the deaths from other causes during that time period were impacted by not being able to gather, not being able to
Hmm.
to have the disposition of their choice when they wanted, when they expected it to be, when they wanted it to be, extending that period. Some people volunteered to wait and hold services later. It started off, oh, this is 2-week national shutdown. Well, and
Yeah.
then it was just supposed to be a few months. And then, it ultimately in some parts of the country became extended to over a year.
Yes.
And some people for health reasons and other reasons, they're still pretty locked down and cautious about gatherings. So, I commend our funeral professionals. I mean, my my grandmother did not die of COVID, but she died in March 2020, at 98 years old. Good long life.
Oh.
But I was, and my mother, her last remaining child, were not able to go to travel out of state to fly to where she died. And so I will never forget Danielle, the funeral director, who through her iPhone set up a graveside service so we could log in through a link, and other family members could log in through a link and hear the pastor and see my cousins and the local relatives gather. They couldn't hear us or see us, but that didn't matter. This was before we figured out Zoom and all that sort of stuff. But
Yeah.
but I'm so grateful for her that she's just like, I think I can do this through YouTube. And sure enough, she live streamed through YouTube. Otherwise, we would have had nothing. We couldn't have,
Yeah.
we
And
physically couldn't get there. So,
that's
her problem solving.
the amazing, the times we live in. It's difficult for us to all experience a pandemic, but how grateful we are to have technology to have
Hmm.
been able to be developed and advanced enough for us to come together in these important times. I mean, even you and I, we're sitting here talking together, and we're in two different states. Again, technology bringing people together. And then, of course, this going out and touching many people, maybe answering some unknown questions or giving them information that they never dreamed was information to be had in the first place, right?
Right. Right. And I
So
think, to answer your question, I think with, over in a normal year, it's about 3 million deaths. Okay. But over the past 2 years, it was that normal 3 million plus a million, or, it was 400,000 one year, 600,000 the other year, 2021 to be precise. So, and the death rate is still high because, of course, deaths of all causes are still happening, COVID deaths, but
correct.
also overdose deaths and violent crimes resulting in death, murders is what I'm trying to say.
And then
Um,
just the other diseases that are out there that take our lives. So
Absolutely.
so death still was happening, although COVID seemed to be the death cause, right? But I think people tend to
Oh,
forget that we still had death going on in the background that happens just naturally, or would happen in a normal year without a pandemic on top of it.
right. Yeah. My point was that we went from an average of like 3 million deaths 2019 and a couple of years before to all of a sudden 3.5 million. And that stayed high. We're anticipating for 2022 was a breather of sorts from COVID, but not from other causes of death. And I think what that means, to go back to your original question, is that maybe the percentage cremation growth was steady, predictable, fine, but the numbers of cremations, numbers of deaths, numbers of people planning was higher than it's ever been historically. And so it makes sense that people started asking questions like, really? burial, cremation, those are my only choices. Really, how can we incorporate technology into this? How can we be greener? How can we, the values that we live with now, why can't we express those in death? And so I think a lot of the new forms of disposition and the increase in popularity of home funerals, for example, which is basically how funerals used to be done, right before there were funeral parlors. So 100 some years ago, we can learn about that in the museum. But anyway, yeah, like before embalming, there was, other ways to refrigerate the body and make it safe to have in your home. There's all sorts of things, like old things that have become popular again, or people are curious about again. And I think it's because we were so many more of us were touched by death in recent years. So it raises question, it supports curiosity. And, so sure, we have a lot of new forms of disposition that are now making their way through, but I think also increased attendance at the museum, right? Because, well, I mean, COVID years aside, because you had to shut down and all of that, but that curiosity has to be satisfied on many levels. So if people didn't know about the museum, they should come, and they can do a virtual tour as well, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you made mention to that, because our numbers have increased dramatically, and a nice steady incline increase. And I don't know if that's because the museum has become more talked about, and it's more, people are becoming more aware of its existence, or is it because we went through COVID and death really became the talk of the town, if you will, right? It was in our news, it was in our daily life, it was the reason why we were segregated, so we wouldn't die, and we were doing things to save our loved ones and keep them from getting ill. And so it was, death was our life during COVID. And so did that lead people into wanting to know more about what goes on in caring for their loved one? Maybe they wanted to be more aware. Maybe they want to be more prepared now. And perhaps that could be the reason for our increase in attendance. And the museum is a fascinating place to really help shed light on that stuff in a very neutral environment, either after an experience to give you a better understanding of what was taking place, or having an opportunity to learn more about it before you are having to deal with it. So, yeah,
Agreed.
I mean, Barbara, the conversations with you, I could probably talk with you for hours.
Well, we have, as a matter of fact, in the past, but I'm grateful for this time together today. Yeah, this was fun.
I am too. And so definitely thank you for all your time, for your expertise. And you have just opened up, so many more questions for me, and hopefully for some of our listeners as well. And I really look forward to having you back again, just so we can dive more into other subjects, because you are a wealth of knowledge, and I want to learn more, and I'm sure our listeners do too.
I would welcome the opportunity to come back, and I'm pleased to talk to you today. So thank you for the opportunity, Genevieve.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for all you do for our industry. Thank you for all you do for the end users and their families, their loved ones, because you really do hold an important job. And we are truly grateful to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining me today on this podcast. And I hope that you will share this episode and our future episodes with family and friends. We look forward to any feedback you have to offer by giving us a review on Apple or Spotify. And we hope that you will join us for a virtual tour at www.nmfh.org. And always remember, any day above ground is a good one.